Some people think Gen Alpha is just the iPad generation. Kids with short attention spans. Kids addicted to screens. Kids who can't focus anymore. But honestly, that explanation is way too shallow, because Gen Alpha might become the first generation in human history whose personality is being shaped by algorithms before adulthood even begins. And that changes psychology completely. Not a little, completely. Because older generations used technology. Gen Alpha is growing up emotionally inside it. Think about how insane that actually is. Before many Gen Alpha kids fully understand identity, relationships, self-worth, or emotional regulation, they already understand viral trends, notifications, algorithms, online validation, content performance. And most adults still don't realize how psychologically powerful that environment is, because childhood itself is changing. Previous generations mostly developed their personality in private. Gen Alpha develops personality in front of invisible audiences, and that one shift alone could reshape human behavior for decades. Now, at first, that might not sound dangerous. In fact, some parts actually look impressive. Gen Alpha learns technology incredibly fast. They adapt quickly, process information rapidly, understand internet culture naturally, sometimes faster than adults. But here's where things get psychologically complicated. Fast adaptation doesn't always mean healthy adaptation. Because the human brain adapts to whatever environment surrounds it most, and Gen Alpha's environment is filled with constant stimulation, constant novelty, constant comparison, constant emotional interruption. Every swipe gives the brain something new. Every short-form video creates microdopamine. Every notification creates anticipation. Every algorithm fights for attention. And over time, the nervous system slowly changes to match that rhythm. That's why silence now feels different for many people. Boredom feels different. Waiting feels different. Even focus feels different. Because when the brain becomes used to constant stimulation, stillness can start feeling emotionally uncomfortable. And this is where most people misunderstand Gen Alpha completely. People say they just have short attention spans, but honestly, that may not even be the real issue. The deeper issue might be this. Their brains are adapting to an environment humans were never psychologically designed for. Think about it. For most of human history, attention was valuable. But now, attention is survival, social survival, emotional survival, identity survival. Because online attention now affects validation, belonging, social relevance, confidence, self-worth, even for children. And children absorb emotional patterns incredibly early, much earlier than adults think. That's why some Gen Alpha kids seem emotionally mature in strange ways, yet emotionally overwhelmed in others. They understand trends early, internet humor early, social dynamics early. But emotional regulation often develops slower than emotional stimulation. And that imbalance creates tension, a lot of tension. Because imagine growing up while constantly seeing better lives, better appearances, better reactions, better popularity, better versions of everyone else, every single day. Eventually, comparison stops feeling occasional. It becomes automatic. And honestly, that changes identity itself. Because slowly, the question stops becoming, who am I really? And starts becoming, what version of me gets attention? That question alone might define Gen Alpha psychologically more than people realize. And here's the scary part. Many people think this only affects kids online. It doesn't. It affects how they think about themselves offline too. Because identity performance eventually follows people everywhere. At school, with friends, even alone. When your brain becomes used to external validation, silence can start feeling like invisibility. And this is where things become emotionally dangerous. Because constant visibility can slowly make people afraid of ordinary life. Ordinary conversations feel slower. Ordinary moments feel quieter. Ordinary experiences feel less stimulating. And eventually, real life can start competing against algorithmic entertainment. That's an impossible competition. Because real life moves slowly. Human emotions move slowly. Healing moves slowly. Relationships move slowly. Trust moves slowly. But algorithms move instantly. When the brain adapts to speed, patience starts feeling emotionally painful. That's why some Gen Alpha kids struggle with deep focus, long conversations, silence reflection, being alone with their thoughts. Not because they're weak, not because they're lazy, but because their nervous systems were trained differently, continuously. And honestly, adults helped create this environment too. That's the uncomfortable truth nobody likes discussing. Parents are overwhelmed. Schools are adapting slowly. Tech companies optimize for engagement. And children became the center of the experiment. Not intentionally, but psychologically, that's what happened. Now, this is where the conversation gets even deeper, because despite all these concerns, Gen Alpha may also become one of the most emotionally self-aware generations ever. And that sounds contradictory, but it's true. Previous generations often hid emotional struggles. Gen Alpha grows up hearing words like burnout, anxiety, trauma, boundaries, emotional exhaustion, mental health, at ages older generations never did. And because of that, many Gen Alpha kids understand emotions intellectually very early, sometimes surprisingly early. But here's the strange psychological contradiction. Understanding emotions conceptually does not automatically mean knowing how to emotionally process them. Someone can know the word anxiety while still having no idea how to regulate it internally. And honestly, that gap between awareness and regulation might become one of the defining psychological struggles of this generation. Because awareness alone doesn't create emotional resilience. Experience does. Human connection does. Reflection does. Safety does. And unfortunately, constant stimulation makes reflection harder. Because reflection requires stillness, and stillness is becoming psychologically unfamiliar. That's why many people today unconsciously avoid silence. The moment quiet appears, the brain reaches for stimulation, music, scrolling, videos, notifications, anything. Because silence now forces people to meet their own thoughts. And many people aren't comfortable there anymore. But this issue goes even deeper than attention. It affects relationships too. Gen Alpha is growing up during the first era where parasocial relationships feel emotionally normal. Children emotionally connect to creators, streamers, AI personalities, digital communities, sometimes before developing deep, real-world emotional bonds. And again, that changes human psychology in ways we still barely understand. Because humans evolved emotionally through physical interaction, tone, presence, eye contact, energy, silence between words. But digital communication removes many of those emotional signals. And when emotional development happens mostly through screens, human connection itself can slowly start feeling different. And honestly, future psychologists will probably spend decades studying this generation, because Gen Alpha may reveal something humanity has never experienced before. What happens when childhood itself becomes algorithmically shaped? Not just entertainment. Childhood, identity, attention, self-worth, emotional development. Everything becomes connected to visibility. And maybe that's why so many people misunderstand Gen Alpha completely. People look at them and think they're distracted. But distraction might just be the surface symptom. Underneath that distraction, there may be overstimulation, identity pressure, constant comparison, attention conditioning, emotional exhaustion, all happening simultaneously. And imagine experiencing all of that before fully understanding yourself yet. That's psychologically intense. But here's the important part. Gen Alpha is not broken. They're adapting, just like every generation adapts. The real question is, what exactly are they adapting into? Because this generation may become more emotionally open, more digitally intelligent, more psychologically aware, and more globally connected than any generation before them. But at the same time, they may also become more overstimulated, more emotionally exhausted, more identity fragmented, and more dependent on external validation. And honestly, both things can be true at once. That's what makes Gen Alpha psychologically fascinating. They are not simply better or worse, they are different. A completely new kind of psychological environment is producing a completely new kind of human behavior. And humanity genuinely does not know yet what the long-term emotional consequences will be. Maybe future adults will become emotionally adaptable in ways we've never seen before. Or maybe constant stimulation will slowly damage humanity's ability to experience presence, stillness, deep focus, real-world connection, internal peace. Nobody fully knows yet. And that uncertainty itself is probably the most important part of this entire conversation. Because right now, human psychology is changing in real time, and Gen Alpha is the first generation living entirely inside that transformation. Not partially, entirely. And maybe one day, people will look back at this era the same way we now look back at the beginning of television, or the Industrial Revolution, or the birth of the internet, as the moment human behavior fundamentally changed. The difference is, this time, the change is happening directly inside childhood itself. And honestly, that may end up becoming one of the biggest psychological experiments in human history, whether humanity was ready for it or not.